When I got into ultra running, I thought it was all about the training. If I trained hard enough, I would get there. But as I progressed through my journey, I realized that training is just the first piece of the puzzle. There are 3 more elements that are arguably more important, and it's only through making epic mistakes that I have learned these lessons the hard way. The final lesson hit hard in my last ultra, and it led to a DNF. So I really hope that you can learn from my mistakes and they help you in your journey into this wonderful sport. Let's get into it. But let's start with training, because that obviously is important. In the past, I've bought plans online and followed very technical programs, but I've realized that for the average ultra runner, it's actually pretty simple. Do 1 long run a week, do 1 speed interval each week, and then fill the rest of your week up with easy-ish runs, and they're just not as long as your long run. Try to build your volume week by week, about 10% a week, add 10% to your long run and 10% to your overall week, and try to mimic the terrain you're going to be racing on as much as possible. So for me, as someone who lives somewhere flat but likes to race in the mountains, that means I tend to spend quite a bit of time on stair climbers and max incline treadmills, as well as getting out onto my local trails. I also feel much better when I fit in my strength training. This year I made a mental shift where I prioritized my strength training just as much as I prioritized my running. What this means is that whereas in the past I'd be running 6 days a week in preparation for my ultras, I've actually dropped that now to 4 days a week running so that I can fit in my 2 strength sessions. In the run up to my last ultra, I hit those 2 strength sessions every single week in the block of my ultra training, and my overall wellness felt the best it had ever felt while in the run up to a race. If you want to see the exact training plan I followed, you can get it by signing up to my email list below. And I have also done a deep dive into the strength training I did during that training block, and I've launched a program called Mountain Strong, which you can also find in the description. Whereas at the beginning of my journey into ultra running, I thought it was all about the training, I now know there are 3 other factors that get you through it. So let's get on to the next one, pacing. In my first ultra, I made all the rookie mistakes. I went out too fast, and even though I knew I shouldn't do it, I was running with my heart rate in the 160s at the beginning. And the reason I was doing that was that the adrenaline was buzzing. In my head, I was thinking, oh, it's game day. I'm supposed to push hard. This is supposed to be a challenge. But the other thing that was happening was that the race was on such steep mountainous terrain, and I hadn't really done much training in that. It actually felt impossible to keep my heart rate down at the time. What I learned that day was that you can cope with that for 5 or 6 or 7 hours, but then you will crash and burn. And even though at the beginning you couldn't find a way to keep your heart rate down, your body will make you find a way eventually. So about 7 hours into that race, I crashed and burned, my quads blew up, and it was an utterly miserable and painful experience. And I was hobbling along, and lo and behold, my heart rate was in the 120s, 130s, but I was in acute pain at the same time. So I did find a way to manage my way through the mountains in a lower heart rate, but not through choice. So the lesson here is, you either choose to go steady and slow and at a manageable heart rate, or your body will force you to go at a manageable heart rate, but it will just be so much more painful and miserable if that's the case. When I do my ultras now, I am really strict with heart rate. I have learned through trial and error and experience that for me, at my age, with my fitness, my heart rate that works is about 135 beats a minute, and that's my go all day pace. In order to stick to that, I've had to practice some different techniques. So when I'm on flattish or undulating terrain, I've got this kind of steady, slow rocking, running movement that I've learned to use. And then if I'm on steeper terrain, I've learned to take small steps and really use my poles, so it's a whole body experience rather than just taking bigger steps and gassing my legs out. So those techniques have been practiced to help me run at that consistent heart rate. Sometimes I chat to friends when I'm telling them about getting into zone 2 running, for example, and they say, oh, but I can't run slow, I can only run at 1 speed. I'm like, well, you haven't practiced. Running slow is a skill, and it will be terrain dependent, so you need to work on different techniques for different terrains. While I was exploring the pacing strategy, I was also starting to notice that in my long runs, particularly after my long runs, and even just in my training block in general, I was very hungry and I started to realize I'm probably not fueling myself well. I did a deep dive into nutrition and I was really lucky that I actually got to interview a dietitian who specializes in helping ultramarathon runners on this channel, and I'll link that video down in the description. But what I've come to realize is that for me, running between 300 to 400 calories an hour during an ultramarathon is what works for me. And I'll push it to the higher end of that spectrum if it's in a tough mountainous terrain, and then lower end of that spectrum if I'm just on easier undulating terrain. And then something else that's really important is to fuel myself well in an ultra block. As soon as I start to go into training mode, ready for a race, rather than just maintenance fitness mode, I will instantly increase my calories. When you're fueling yourself in your training, you're fueling yourself for your training, but also your recovery. You're eating for the next day. And there has been research to show that if you're underfueled while training regularly, that's going to increase your risk of injury. In a training block, the most important thing is to stay consistent. The number one thing that gets in the way of consistency is injury. So you're eating to prevent injury as well. Personally, in my training, what that means is I'm eating as many whole foods as possible, just higher calories. I don't really think too much about my macros. I'm probably on about 40% carbs, 30-30 protein and fat ratio. But whenever I talk about fueling, I'll always get a comment down below saying, oh, you should be fat adapted. Maybe that's true. I just can't stick to that in my family life. And I've found that carbs work for me. In races, I go into very high carb modes. So that 300 to 400 calories an hour is made up mostly from carbs. Some of the real food I have will have some protein and fat in it inevitably, but it's mostly a carb-based model that I use. And now we move on to possibly the most important part of becoming an ultra runner, and that's mindset. Mindset is the thing that I failed on in my last ultra, and it's the thing that led to my DNF. I've made a whole video and I told the story about that DNF, but in a nutshell, it was the biggest and toughest race I'd ever done. It was a 100k mountain ultra. It was probably going to take me about 24 hours, but I went into it with a virus, and the virus kind of knocked me physically and mentally. Now, what I didn't tell you in that video was how I quit in the moment. Now, what happened was I was climbing the 5th climb, and it was always on the ups that my lungs felt the worst. And on that up, I just had had enough. I got it in my head that I'm going to quit at the next aid station. On the way down though, I actually started to feel okay. My legs felt strong. I ran the whole way. I started to overtake people. But in my head, I was praying for a DNF van to be at the next aid station. I just wanted it to take me back to the start line. I wasn't really paying attention to the fact that I was running pretty well. I had in my head the idea that I was going to quit. When I got to that aid station, a man stood up in front of me literally as I walked into it, and he said, right, who's going in the van? There was a van right there waiting to take us back to the start line. And without pausing or thinking, I put my hand up and went, me, don't leave without me. I'm in the van. In hindsight, what I realized that man was, he was a test. He was a test from the running gods. And the test was, are you going to take the easy option or are you going to take the hard option? And without thinking, I took the easy option. This has been playing on my mind a lot for the last couple of months. David Goggins has an idea which he calls the 1 second rule. It doesn't matter how many seconds you're in a race or in a challenge, the only second that matters is the 1 second you quit. That's the second that's going to play on your mind. And trust me, it does play on your mind. But what did I learn from this experience, and hopefully how can it help you? Well, first of all, I wasn't clear on my purpose going into the race. I needed to have a crystal clear reason why I was there and what I wanted to get out of the race. I also needed to know how I was going to behave when it got really hard, because ultras do get hard. You need to know how you're going to behave, what you're going to do when the thoughts in your head start wearing away. The thoughts in your head, they sound very logical and intelligent and true, but they're not. They're all illusions. I had a really interesting chat with someone in the comments of that DNF video, and what they said was they write themselves a letter before every race. It's a only open in case of emergency type letter. And I'm definitely going to do this from now on. I needed to know why I was there, why it matters, what I'm going to do when it gets really tough, and I needed to have some clarity around all of that. I took the easy option, and it's been playing on my mind ever since. But all we can do as ultra runners is pick ourselves up, get back to training and try again. And that's what I'm doing. So I hope today's video has helped you, and until next time, happy training.